Great, thanks. And it is, in my opinion, the definition of perfect weather outside, so I appreciate you all being in this indoor space with me right now. So this paper comes from what I think of as like a reframing or an expansion of a very common trope, which is that maps tell stories. So we see this all over the place, like many of the sessions and papers at this conference, or Esri story maps, where maps are part of a story. Or it can mean things like maps have authorship, maps have perspective, they have intent, we communicate or miscommunicate with them, they have bias, so on and so forth. I know people in this room have written a lot about this kind of stuff. It's not a new idea. So for instance, in a reference map, or there's a problem where this starts to break down. So for instance, in a reference map like this, there's no plot, there's no conflict and resolution, there's no kind of the traditional trappings of what we think of as a story. In other words, like all metaphors, the metaphor starts to break down. So over the past few years, I've been telling stories with maps, trying to use a graphic narrative style like comics. And I've been struggling with this limitation in terms of thinking of maps as stories as I've started a new project this last year. The project is about, I didn't realize it was animated, there we go. It's about these 10 bird species that were all delisted from the Endangered Species Act because they're extinct. So they've been officially declared extinct. And my aim has been I'm a birder, so my aim has been to map out what happened to them and as a form of like bearing witness to the loss of these species. So this is one of them. It's the bright-old white-eye, or it's a relative to the bright-old white-eye, a different subspecies to the one that's extinct now on Guam. And I actually took this, the National Aviary in Pittsburgh is amazing, it turns out. And I was there before NACIS last year, so this is a picture from the National Aviary in Pittsburgh last year. So anyway, as I delved into the project, I've been hitting this problem. There's a narrative side to the story, like one could map, the shrinking ranges of these birds, or most of them are island species. So there's the story of kind of island biogeography and the tenuousness of species on islands. But the tensions that I want to explore are more around, as I was saying earlier, witnessing the loss of these birds on their own terms and not simply seeing them, for instance, as valuable to outsiders like myself. For most of these, 9 out of 10 are island birds, and the other one is in the southern US, and I live in Minnesota. So not seeing them simply as canaries in the coal mine as kind of warnings to the rest of us, while on the other hand, also realizing that in some sense they are warnings to the rest of us. Guam no longer has songbirds, for instance, so it's hard to be there and not be reminded of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. There's no birdsong or evening song in Guam. And more broadly, there's a tension between the very overt reality of colonization and colonial violence on Guam, especially, but also in Hawaii, where 8 of the birds were, and in South Carolina, where the Bachman's warbler was seen last, coexisting with the beauty of these places. So it occurred to me as I've been trying to struggle with this project that some maps, and by some maps I'm meaning like those maps that are like individual freestanding maps, not maps that are part of a story, like say in a piece of journalism, are already actually good at what I'm trying to do, which is specifically because they aren't really stories. Maps are especially adept at some kinds of stories, scare quotes intentional, specifically because they don't have a linear narrative. So I'm finding I'm using the map more like a poem or as poetry than as story, and I hesitate to say this because, one, I'm not at all a poet, and it sounds pretentious for some reason, but at least at times, I think poetry might be a better metaphor than stories for the work that maps can do, or at least some maps can do. I'm not into kind of universal claims about things. So in the case of the project I'm working on, creating maps to witness something isn't trying to resolve it, but simply to see it consciously. All right, so let's turn to some maps about the bright-old white-eye as an example. My mind over the last years kept turning to this government document, which is probably the only time I'll ever say that, from 1990. It's from the Fish and Wildlife Service about Guam and Rota. They're the two most southernmost islands in the Mariana chain. And there's certainly a story. This is a government document with all the kind of biases. It's a federal agency literally headquartered on the other side of the world, right? Or in the sense of like the story that we bring to the map. We know what happened to these birds now because the document's 34 years old. And there's a chronology to the narrative. So this is one of the maps from the report, the distribution of the white-eye just a couple, 3 years before it went extinct. Here's 2 other birds on the island showing 2 different years of their diminishing ranges. And these are those last 2 birds you saw. These are also at the National Aviary. So the map that stuck out to me, though, in all of this is the next one, and it's fairly far into the report. And it's kind of after you've looked at the data and they're trying to give suggestions about what to do, so what protection is needed on the island. So I think as found art or as found poetry, this map is super impactful in its placement on the page, a sea of white space. I'm going to zoom in a little on the next slide so you can see it better. So to state the obvious, in case those of you in the back can't read it, they've simply labeled the entire island as essential habitat. And whether this was created out of a dark sense of humor, which was my initial thought, or maybe a righteous anger, or both, or maybe it was the required output from a particular rubric mandated by the federal agency, I don't know. But there's definitely a pathos to this map that I'm reading into it. And I admit it's not a pathos that's common in many maps. So it's maybe not the fairest example of like maps as poetry, though in my mind it's like the perfect distillation of the idea. So let's back up to the beginning of the report, in the 1990 report. So this is just a location map of Guam. And it's obviously limited by the computers and technology of the day, but much like poetry is characterized by an economy of words, I think this map is actually communicating with a kind of incredible efficiency. It's just lines and text. Poetry, or at least some poetry, and again, not a poet, slows you down, and it asks you to pause, to mull over words, to reread that stanza or that line. Much like this map, and I think many maps, like road atlases, Google Maps, wall maps in your high school classroom, invite the reader to pause for a bit and explore and find themselves like where they are in the world, where they are in the map. I know I'm not at all the first person to say this about maps, right? And so to shift directions a bit and think briefly about map production, this is how it's playing in kind of what I'm currently doing in my project. So this is the tip of the island where most of these birds were seen last is Retidian Point. And I went up there on my last day in Guam, and it's really a place of contrast. So it has these like absurdly like postcard-like beaches, miles of them, literal miles, sitting underneath a massive military installation. So around the corner from the previous picture is this picture. I'll show you what it's saying in the next slide. And the whole place is completely devoid of birds. So what I'm wanting to do is juxtapose the beauty of the place with the destruction rather than narratively explain it. And I'm trying to hold the tension. I'm hoping that holding the tension of just placing these things side by side might allow it to speak with a little bit more power. So for instance, in this simple example, labeling wildlife refuges and military bases on the same road, depending on which direction you go, or the contrast between labeling the pristine beaches and the sign that says small arms firing range, surface danger zone, restricted area. So maps might be particularly good to tell certain stories, in other words, because there's no set place for the reader to start and finish. And life, as we all know itself, doesn't have a clear narrative, so maybe maps are particularly good because they also don't have clear narratives. So perhaps at times the map's power comes from its lack of a linear narrative, and perhaps at times it's more akin to poetry. Maybe some kinds of maps are less story and more poem. Thanks.